Hi everyone, it's Christopher Paolini again, and I'm today talking with the awesome John Stevens. Hi John.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you. I like that. The awesome John Stevens. Very nice.
Now for those who don't know, you're the author of the Emerald Atlas, the Fire Chronicle, and the upcoming...
The Black Reckoning.
And we were just talking about what an awesome title The Black Reckoning is.
Thank you. I don't know how it is with you, but I find titles to be incredibly difficult to come up with, The title for my first book, The Emerald Atlas, for a long time was called, it's called The Wibberleys and the Wizard of Cambridge Falls. And I sent that to the man who is our respective agents, and he said, I love the book. It's the worst title I've ever heard.
It does sound a bit like a Disney television show, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? I think it is. It's very similar to one. And so I spent a lot of time coming up with the idea of I wanted, because there are like 3 magic books that the kids in the books go searching for in the saga, I wanted the title of each one to refer to a specific book. So I wanted this last book in the Black Reckoning to be about this book called The Reckoning. And also I liked, I'm sure you feel the same way, like you want your titles to have like multiple meanings, different levels. And so I wanted the idea of The Reckoning to be the title, and also like the right idea of a reckoning is like a debt that has to be paid, like a balance due. And then when like everybody's kind of like weighed at the very end, like a final judgment, because the main character has to end up making judgments upon characters.
I think I've had trouble with each of my books. They all had title problems of one sort or another that I could get into. But now I've read the first 2 books and very much enjoyed them. What drew you to fantasy in the first place?
I mean, I think you go back to your first love, in a sense. I feel like it was fantasy books that I really fell in love with when I was a reader. Like I think every writer starts off as a big reader,
Mm-hmm.
And those are the books that I fell in love with when I was first really kind of like starting to read books on my own. My dad read The Hobbit to us when I think I was in 2nd grade or something. And then as soon as I could read it myself, I did. And then I just kind of like, I was off and running at that point. But then there was a point like in my early 20s where I really thought I was going to be like a contemporary literary novelist, like a David Foster Wallace, And so that was like the first novel I tried to write. And it was terrible. God, it was just awful. And at the end of it, I finished grad school. I got an MFA in creative writing. And I finished grad school, and I just completely fell out of love with contemporary literary fiction. And what I realized, like when I was around 30, I started reading fantasy again, and reading kids' fantasy especially. Mm-hmm. And it was like all of a sudden I was like, it was like a coming home in a sense. I was like, oh, this is what I love. This is what I fell in love with at the beginning. It was that sense. It was like that Narnia-esque thing of stepping through the wardrobe. Like that was the feeling that I had always missed. That feeling of transportation, of being taken to another place, right, that you get in a real fantasy novel and a great fantasy novel. And so I just spent a bunch of years just kind of like immersing myself and delving into it again. And I would say I went back to the kids stuff, like kids fantasy novels in particular, partially because those are the things that I loved when I was a kid. And then I'd read at that point a few books which were more fantasy books aimed at kids, like your books, number 1, and then Philip Pullman's books as well. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, there are people writing fantasy novels for younger readers that are like serious, and that people pay attention to the sentences, and they care about the world. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, there's a world here that I would want to enter into. So
why did you choose to write the story of Emerald Atlas and the sequels specifically? What specifically about that story appealed to you? And how did you get the idea for it?
Sure. The story is about 3 kids who've been separated from their parents. I don't know how I came up with that. It's amazing. The first time that's been done. And they end up having to, like, in order to find their parents, they end up saving the world. And in the first book, what happens is they discover this book, like that when they put a photo inside it, they get carried back in time to the moment the picture was taken. Mm-hmm. And it turns out to be like the book of time. It has greater powers than that, etc. And
it's a good thing they didn't put in a picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon.
Yeah, it's totally true. I never thought of that. So what happened was, this was like 10 years ago now. Wow. I live in Los Angeles. I'm from Virginia, and my parents and my older sister live in Virginia. My younger sister lives in Atlanta, Georgia. Mm-hmm. And I was at home here in Los Angeles, and I had the desire to write like a children's fantasy novel. And I was also kind of missing my family back on the East Coast, And So one day I'm looking through an old photo album and I see a picture of my sisters and myself when we were on vacation, like in 1981. And I had this wave of nostalgia. And I was like, oh, if I only had like a magic photo album, I could put myself, a photo in there and be taken back to that time where my family was all together. It'd be great. And so that was really like the eureka moment where I had on one hand like the magical apparatus, like a book that takes them back through time and space, and also like the theme of a family that's been separated and is working to pull themselves back together. And then after that, I just started expanding it out, until they end up having to save the world. Came up with a bad guy, a doomed love affair, all this stuff, all that stuff I love.
Yeah, the fun stuff, the crunchy drama stuff.
Yeah. And also, I'd written a bunch of these like television shows about young people, like Gilmore Girls and the OC and the Gossip Girl. And as you yourself know, whenever you write a show, anything that has a young protagonist, essentially you're telling a coming of age story. And one of the reasons I really liked writing those television shows about kids, because you're actually watching them make the decisions about the people they're going to end up becoming. And like young people's lives have an inherent dramatic shape because of that. Like when you get to be my age, like you are who you are, I mean, but when you're like 14, 15, 16, like every year, every choice, you're making huge changes in yourself. And everything also has this incredible amount of drama where it's like things are happening to you for the first time. Like the first time you kiss someone, the first time you have your heart broken, the first time, this happens, or like, you feel things very vibrantly and very hotly, which again, just is like a great fodder for a dramatist.
Okay. So I always like asking authors I'm interviewing this question, and I think it's a difficult question to answer. You may or may not have an answer.
Okay.
But given the number of stories you've written, do you find that there's one theme or element that you always return to? The one sort of thing that always makes you respond to a story and say, yes, this is something I want to write about?
That's a good question. It's a tricky question.
I asked that to Robin Hobb one time, and her answer was blood.
I think it's. I do think it's. I'm going to just kind of like call back to the answer I just gave you. I think it's a coming of age stories. I do think it's watching young people make the choices about who they're going to become, because I feel like, especially like when you just make the decision when you're young to be a writer, it's like you're making a very conscious and, in my mind, kind of adventurous and bold and courageous decision about the shape of your life. And so. And it could go bad very easily. I mean, odds are it will go bad,
Yeah.
So, telling stories about people who are actually trying to shape their lives and make decisions about their lives when they're young, I just find that very compelling.
Emerald Atlas is your first published novel, but you are a professional writer in other capacities. Why don't you tell viewers about that a little as well?
Sure. I am also a television writer. I started writing in about 1999, I guess, for a show called Gilmore Girls. I had moved out here to Los Angeles from grad school. I had initially wanted to be a novelist, and then I found it to be too difficult. And so I got a job writing for Gilmore Girls, and then I wrote for that for a bunch of years, and then some other teen drama shows like The OC and Gossip Girl. And right now I write for a show called Gotham. So yeah, writing children's young fantasy novels and also writing television. Makes you a little schizophrenic, but...
I remember I was actually in New York City at one time and literally was walking out of the hotel I was staying at. Random House put me up, and I saw this film crew outside the front of the hotel, and turned out you were directing that episode, weren't you?
I was directing that episode. You should have come by. I would have put you in as an extra.
I didn't know it was you. I mean, we were probably like 20 feet from each other.
Yeah, the directing is interesting. I've done some of it, and it absolutely changes your writing.
How so?
You learn to really tell the story visually as much as anything, and you learn that how much you don't need. What you end up doing when you're both directing and then when you look at it in the editing room afterwards is you're always cutting right to the moment, and then you're finding also you're very aware of the turn inside of a scene, be it a chapter scene, what have you. It's like, oh, I'm leading up to this moment, and this is where the story is going to turn. That surprise or that new development happens, and it veers off in another way. Making sure you carve that moment out in an appropriate way, and you also learn to, as much as you do in writing, and I'm sure you feel this too. It's like, you feel like the dramatic and narrative momentum inside of a story.
Yeah.
Where like things need to go faster here. Now I'm really going to slow down and tell every single slow beat of this moment because it's such a tense moment. It can carry it. You really feel that in directing. You're like, oh, we got to go through this fast. And here I'm just going to build it out and actually shoot a lot of pieces for the scene because we're going to like stretch time out really slowly here. So yeah, it's amazing. You learn a lot. Whenever you do any kind of cross-discipline thing, you bring something new to it, I think.
So you feel like your ability to control the internal stresses of the scenes and also just building the scenes one from the next has improved as a result of the directing and the television experience.
I think it has. I mean, I could be wrong. I could be fooling myself to make myself feel better about it. But I do think it has. You know how it is when you're writing, when you're doing anything for a long period of time. It's not that you get stuck in a rut, but you start to see things in a certain way, and you start to like chunk information, and you just know how to do it, and you know how to do it, and know how to do it. And it's like you just need to shake yourself up sometimes and just see things from an entirely different perspective in some ways. And that's what it does.
Do you ever have difficulty going from the style of scripts to then, writing a book? Because they're two very, very different things. And, all scripts are written in present tense, and description just isn't as important. I mean, it's important, but it's not as important as it is in a book, and so forth and so on.
I have trouble when I'm at the beginning of a book, like when a book really has, before like the tone of the book and the story is really set,
Mm-hmm.
Because like the beginning of a book is hard enough all by itself, I find, where you're trying to like find the story and see where it's going. And when you're also having to like tic-tac back and forth between two different tones, it's really difficult. But once the story's like up and running and kind of dictating its own momentum,
Mm-hmm.
and when I know what the tone and the voice of that story is, then that transference is not all that difficult. And in fact, I find it a bit of a relief, frankly. Just because I can take a break from screen, because so much of screenwriting and script writing is all about architecture.
Mm-hmm.
You spend so much time planning the pieces out,
Yeah.
whereas so much of writing is really just about getting into the moment and letting the moment unfurl.
Do you still do some of that architecture for your books prior to actually starting the story, or do you let it evolve as you write?
I kind of tic-tac back and forth, where when I have an idea for a new book, or at the beginning of a new book, I'll usually spend about 6 weeks or 2 months just writing material and scenes that take place all over the book, So I get to kind of to gather a lot of clay, on the wheel. And then from that, I'll go off and do an outline. Like once I was like, oh, I know I have these pieces here, and I'll do a rough outline. And then, sorry about that. I don't know. I went for a run today. Never exercised. That was a problem. I think exercising in Los Angeles is just like you're asking for it.
Yeah.
So then once I have kind of that clay on the wheel and I do a rough outline, then I'll try to write like a 10, 20 page synopsis of the book, where I think it's going to go. And then I'll spend anywhere between 4 and 6 months doing a rough draft. And then I'll periodically, all through that, I'm always rejiggering my outline. I imagine, do you do it that way as well, where like you're always working back and forth on an outline?
To a degree, I find your process unusual in the sense that you're writing all of these sort of fragments and scenes before even having the overall structure. It's almost like you're thinking to yourself, this is something I find interesting, or this is something I find cool, so I'm going to go ahead and write a first draft of that. And I think I would have difficulty doing that because I always feel like all of the scenes leading up to a scene inform that scene, so I'd have trouble writing it out of context.
I'm not saying it's the best way to do it, because sometimes you.
No, I just find it interesting.
Joss Whedon uses it. He talks about it as his dessert first philosophy. Like he's like, I really want to write that scene. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and write that scene, and it works sometimes really well in the sense of you're driving to Chicago, so. You know where you're headed, so it's even fine after you take detours because you're going back there. It doesn't work as well because a lot of times I've found I've gotten locked into certain scenes and ideas that then don't work. And I end up with a Frankenstein story where I'm having to wrench the story around to get it to this place. And 9 times I end up jettisoning that scene I wrote 9 months ago that I always thought was going to be a pivotal moment in the book. So I'm not sure it's the best way of doing it, but I find just like sitting down and outlining before I know where the story is going is like I just stare at the board for forever.
For me, I really have to know how the story is beginning, and I really have to know how it's going to end. And to me, it's like I can fill in everything in between once I've got that, but I have to have that to start with. Otherwise, there really isn't a story. I mean, an ending can be an awesome thing, but without the preceding material, it's not a story. And same thing for a beginning. It's just a kernel then. You need both the ending and the beginning to fill in that horrible middle, that place where everything goes wrong.
Yeah, the middle's the worst.
The middle is the worst. Absolutely the worst. So how does your, we have the same editor as well. We've got the same agent. We've got the same editor, the wonderful Michelle Fry. So what's your editing process like? I mean, do you do any editing with yourself, or you and your wife, or someone else before you give it to Michelle? Or
Oh yeah, big time. I mean, Michelle would clearly fire me if she saw my early drafts. Where I mean, it's one of the things where I like to write a full draft, and then my wife reads the first draft of that, and I make the changes, and then I'll revise that fully again myself. And then I have about between 4 and 6 people here in Los Angeles, other writers I know, who will read the draft and give me notes. And I usually stage that out off like 2 drafts of people. Somewhere in there, our editor Michelle reads that draft. So she's usually reading somewhere between a second and a third draft.
Makes
somewhere
sense.
like second and a half draft. The problem is usually by that time I'm so late that I just have to give her something anyway. I'd rather hold off longer, but at that point I'm so wildly past any deadline that's been set. I'm like, fine, just take it.
Deadlines are a mixed blessing. Sometimes I hate them, but sometimes they're that kick in the pants you need to actually finish the project.
Yeah, they're awful, but I do think that it's important. It's funny, I was reading this David Foster Wallace book-length interview thing, called I think it's called "And of Course You Always End Up Becoming Yourself," which was about a guy. It was never published as an interview. A guy from Rolling Stone had followed him around for 3 days during the Infinite. He had been under deadline to finish Infinite Jest, and he said it was an awful, awful experience. I'll never sell an idea for a book before or be under deadline again. I never want to experience that. He never did. But by my token, he never wrote anything as good as Infinite Jest again.
Yeah.
So maybe he actually needed that deadline in order to get it done, to get it finished.
Well, the corollary in the film world is there are, dozens and dozens of examples of filmmakers who started off with limited resources, with limited budgets and teams, and turned out brilliant work, and then they got $200-300 million thrown at them, and they can't produce anything of quality.
I know. Take all the time you want. Yeah, it's. I think sometimes being under the gun and being forced to do something is a really good thing. It actually, what I find that a lot of times I find myself afraid to write the story a little bit. It's weird. It's I'm afraid to let the story accelerate and move forward.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it's gonna be over too quickly. And what I've always learned in deadlines is just go for it, because eventually the deadline will come in. I'm like, well, now I just have to write it, and you end up writing it and writing the story fast, and it always expands and deepens and has more texture. And so I think my new philosophy is just attack the story.
Well, and if you write too slowly, you lose any sense of flow, of how things fit together organically. And I had Michelle told me a couple of times, she was just kind of smacking me upside the head verbally and saying, that more than once the writing I did faster was better than the writing I did slow, where I was gnawing over every single word and trying to turn it into this gorgeous polished prose and then just killing any sense of flow.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. It's funny, when I look back at the books, the chapters that I like best are the chapters that I wrote most quickly.
Interesting.
There's something about it, it moves well, there's a lot of flow, and then when you're writing it fast and you're inside the moment, you're kind of that feeling where you're following the story, you're trying to catch up with it.
Yes.
And then it slows you down at that moment, saying, okay, we've been going fast, and now slow it down and write it. Yeah, because otherwise you just get lost in it.
I've heard of a technique that some authors use, some writers use. I've never done it myself, but I'm almost tempted to do it. And what they do is they take their MS Word manuscript or whatever it is, and they shrink the font size down until they're able to print the entire book out on 60 to 80 pages, the whole book. And then they lay it out on the floor in front of them, and they use a highlighter or something, and they mark the big sections of the book. And that way they can just look at it and just see the whole story in a glance and get a sense for the architecture of it, how it fits and flows. And I've always thought that's an interesting idea, although I've not done it myself.
In my office I have a huge whiteboard. It's 8 feet across and about 5 feet big. And I'll continually revise the outline of the book on that. So at any moment I can walk over there and look at the entire a book, in a sense, in outline form, where each chapter is there with like 4-line events of each chapter. So in a sense, I can get like a feel for it. But
so, do you tend to work in by hand? Do you write by hand, MS Word?
I go back and forth. What I tend to do these days is my first draft is written kind of half by hand, half in typed. Where I write a lot in notebooks, and then I'll transfer that onto the computer.
Yeah.
And then when it's going really quickly, I'll tend to write it on the computer because I write much faster. I type much faster than I can write.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm writing fast by hand, I end up going back to going, what the fuck is this thing? Because it's just completely illegible, And then what I really like to do is I really like to write my second draft by hand. Because
Really?
I find it gets me in touch with like at that point I have the story,
Right.
And at that point, if I write it by hand, I find it's that thing where it's like if you walk down a street that you've always driven down,
Mm-hmm.
down at that time, and because you're going slower, you've noticed things you never noticed before. And I find it always like gives a different texture to my writing.
Now, to be fair, your manuscripts aren't 300,000 words long, so
That is true.
that helps.
That's true. You're giving yourself a break. No, but it's true. I don't have like a quill pen like Neil Stephenson or whoever it is, but yeah. No, it's easier when you're writing a middle grade book that's for like 100,000 words.
So, are there any fantasy books you've read in the past, let's say, year or so that you've really enjoyed?
I mean, the second Rothfuss book I really enjoyed as well.
Wise Man's Fear.
Yeah. I love, how do you pronounce the names of those ninja-esque people that he goes and lives among for a while?
I couldn't possibly attempt it.
But I love that sequence. That was one of my favorite sequences recently. I'm working my way through. I mean, I'm not reading stuff that's published this year. I'm working my way through the Blade Itself series.
Mm-hmm.
I just finished the second one.
That's Abercrombie, right?
Abercrombie books, yeah.
I'd be interested to discuss that with you once you finish it. I had a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just finished the second one, so I'm on the third one of that.
Yeah.
And I read Heroes first, which actually takes place after the Blade Itself series, I think. And I just finished, what did I just finish? Oh, I just finished. Just because sometimes, like, when you're a bit burned out, I find nothing makes you feel better than reading a Terry Pratchett novel. So I just read Hogfather,
That's a good choice.
which is just like, it just makes you feel great.
So now, you mentioned you got was it a MFA?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that helped you become a better writer, or is it something like if someone's looking to become a published writer, would you recommend it?
No, would be my simple answer. I would say the MFA is effective, is that what it does, it gives you cover. It gives you a good argument for not getting a job for 2 years.
Gotcha.
But it's good for, I find, but beyond that, I mean, in all seriousness, I don't think it didn't really teach me to write or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is like you're devoting 2 years of your life to going to this school to learn to be a writer, in theory, or to write. What it does is it makes you approach the enterprise with seriousness, where you're not just going to say, oh, I'm just going to like to be a writer, I'm going to work a little bit here, work a little bit there. You're like, oh, no, wait, there's a huge opportunity cost to going to something to do for 2 or 3 years. Like, you're not doing something else, so you're going to devote yourself to it. And so, like, really approaching this, saying, oh, this is going to be my career, the thing I'm going to do in my life, was important to me. And meeting other people who felt the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times when you're a writer, until you go out and like publish books and like meet people, it's a very solitary existence,
Yeah.
and you don't meet other writers and you don't see other people, and you're going and you spend some of your time thinking, am I crazy?
That's one of the reasons I've started writing in local cafes, actually, is just to get out of the house, get out of my office, because especially in a place as isolated as Montana, just being around other people is sometimes harder than you would think.
Absolutely. And just being around other writers, I mean, that's what it is. It's like, I don't really think you learn, at least in the MFA program I went to, it was great. I value it greatly, but I don't know that I necessarily learned anything there. Besides the fact of just being around other writers was like a lot of fun and instructive as like a way to live one's life.
Now, given that your book's coming out tomorrow on the 7th, I have to ask what every single one of your fans is going to ask probably halfway through tomorrow, which is, when's your next book coming out?
That's what my agent's asking, too. That's what our agent's asking. I don't know. I started writing something, and at the pace I'm going, it will be done in probably 20 years.
And is it young adult, or is it something else?
It's middle grade. It's the same age right now. It's the same age as it is right now. But granted, I'm like literally 3 weeks into writing it. So, after I wrote this book, and you probably felt the same way, like when you finish those long pieces, like a big chunk, like 3 books or 4 books in your case, it takes a while to decompress out of that.
Oh, it took a year and a half for me.
Yeah. I mean, and I finished like the real editing on this book probably in September, something like that, you know. And Michelle was sending me stuff through the fall. And then I had another job. But it's only about now, like in the last month, that I've been feeling like, oh, I'm going to start writing something else. Yeah. So I would say this summer I'll have a good sense of what I'm working on.
Well, as always, it's a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for taking the time to do this interview.
Oh, it was super fun. I hope you liked the book.
Oh, you have to send me a signed copy.
I will. I'll send you one.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for everyone for watching, and go read John's books. I personally very much enjoyed the first 2 books. I highly recommend them to anyone who is looking for a good fantasy book. You won't be disappointed.
Thanks, Christopher.